You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining this special edition of the American Revolution. I had a chance to speak with Alan Pell Crawford, whose new book, This Fierce People, The Untold Story of America's Revolutionary War in the South, is going to be released on July 2nd, 2024. Crawford has also written a book called Twilight at Monticello about the final years of Thomas Jefferson, and also a book called How Not to Get Rich, The Financial Misadventures of Mark Twain. Mr. Crawford and I had the opportunity to speak over Zoom about the topic of his new book, This Fierce People, and our views about the war in the South. Well, hello, and welcome to this special edition of the American Revolution. With us today is author Alan Crawford, who is the author of a new book called This Fierce People, The Untold Story of America's Revolutionary War in the South. Mr. Crawford, welcome.
Thank you, Michael.
So what inspired you to write this particular topic?
I was asking myself that recently, and I thought I got very interested at one point in George Washington. So I would read biographies of Washington and books on the war. I remember one of them is entitled, and it's a good book, I'm not disparaging it in any way, I think it's called George Washington's War. And so as I would read and learn more and more about the Revolution, it occurred to me that a great deal of it was being fought and won with minimal interference, let's put it that way, by Washington. And I thought, this is peculiar. I don't quite understand this because we've got a standard narrative, which is the Boston Tea Party and Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, and George Washington takes command in 75, and then we get the Declaration of Independence, and George Washington crosses the Delaware, and there's the Valley Forge, and then almost in the standard narratives, almost by magic, the British surrender at Yorktown, and Washington comes south. And this was puzzling to me because there's a vast amount of time that takes place, time that passes between the troops leaving Valley Forge, for example, and the British surrender. And a lot of things are going on there that are huge contributors and causes of that surrender. And Washington is not there. One can say, well, this is some kind of misunderstanding or propaganda of some kind. Or then what eventually dawned on me as I began to dig deeper into it and try to figure out what was actually going on, is that rather than Washington being diminished in my eyes, in some respects, he was amplified in that there's a wonderful letter he wrote to Nathaniel Greene, who's the commander of the Southern Department. And Washington says, okay, I'm giving you this job after Gates was cashiered. And he says, but I'm not there. I'm here in New Jersey, I think is where he is at the time. And he says, I don't know what's going on down there where you're going to be. I don't know the disposition of the enemy. I don't know what our own troops are. I don't know, basically he says, I don't know the topography. I really don't know what's going on there. I have full faith in your ability to make the right decisions and to understand all those things and to know those things that I can't possibly know where I am. And it's up to you to figure this out. And that's a wonderful moment, I think, in that it's an example of Washington's ability to, his judge of character and his ability to not to micromanage things, to delegate authority, and these things that we recognize today as components of leadership. So Washington's saying, go get this done. Tell me what you're doing. Tell me what's going on, but don't expect me to figure this out for you because I can't. That's just a wonderful moment, I think, because Washington's own ideas of leadership change during the war. he writes a letter, I believe, to Patrick Henry at one point, and he says, what we're going to need to run this army, to win this war, are gentlemen. Basically, he says, gentlemen of property and honor and a reputation. So he's going on a kind of a European idea of what he wants in an officer. He's got a few of them in place early in the war. Philip Schuyler, I believe, is one of them. And then over time, that doesn't work. And he begins to see merit and promise and ability in unlikely people, one of whom is Greene. He says, none of this is working, but I'm going to leave you to figure this out in the South, while the British and my army are in a kind of stalemate. The British, I believe, are in New York, and Washington is positioned out in New Jersey, and they're just kind of waiting for some kind of cataclysmic battle that never takes place. And so the real action after Monmouth, which is sort of the period that I'm covering, is in the South. And if you look at sort of a lot of standard accounts of the war, for a number of reasons, there will be one chapter toward the end that will be entitled something like The Southern Campaign, as if it's a footnote or a little add-on. Okay, we have to write about that, so we're going to write about it. But the real story is George Washington crossing the Delaware and Valley Forge. All those things are important. But the story I wanted to tell was what's going on during that, I think it's 3 years between the last Battle of the North and what happens, why the British eventually throw in the towel. That's the story I wanted to tell because I wanted to understand it myself. And the more I learned, the more interesting the people and the events were.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, yeah, major combat operations in the North pretty much ended with Monmouth in 1778. And, we have until late 1781 when we get to Yorktown. And you're right, the war really moved to the South after that time, after 1778. And I think you're right about George Washington evolving over time, although we see that in a lot of wars. I think the idea that the people we think make a good officer in peacetime don't always make a good officer in wartime. And we see a shift in the leadership in a lot of armies. I think we saw it in the Civil War. I think we saw it in World War II, to different officers over time as they prove themselves in combat. And I think Greene definitely falls into that category as well.
When we think of George Washington's judge of character, unfortunately, Benedict Arnold is always the first person we think of. And then we say, oh boy, he got that wrong. And I think that that's grossly unfair, which makes Washington all the more impressive, I think.
Yeah, and Washington had troubles as well because his hands were somewhat tied by Congress, who insisted on having control over who the various commanders were. Earlier in the war, Washington was very happy with that because he himself was fairly inexperienced and wasn't particularly confident in who he was picking. But you can see over time, he does have much more decided opinions, yet still feels the need to defer to Congress. I mean, I guess in the South, we really start out with Robert Howe as the first commander of the Southern Department, and he gets almost no notice at all these days because he didn't do a whole lot down there other than kill a signer of the Declaration in a duel, which got him kicked out of the South. And then we have, of course, we have a couple minor characters in there until Benjamin Lincoln comes down. Lincoln surrenders the army at Charleston in 1780, which is really the beginning of the war in the South.
Yeah.
And then, of course, after that, Lincoln's capture, Congress decides to send Horatio Gates down with a second army. Washington is not particularly happy with that, but he and Gates have a lot of politics in their past. The whole, issue at Valley Forge where Congress was trying to shove Washington out and bring Gates in and that sort of thing. Washington, I don't think, felt confident saying, no, I don't think we should send Gates down there. He kind of sent him down, and we saw what happened, and it was a mess. And then of course, when we end up with Greene.
Now, there was also some bad blood between Washington and Gates over one of the battles in the North. And I cannot remember which one that was, where I think Gates won some battle and he reported back to Congress, but didn't even tell Washington what had happened. And I think Washington's feelings were hurt. And then, I guess in August of 1780, at Camden, the Southern Army is pretty much annihilated under Gates. And Gates apparently leaves the battlefield and rides like 60 miles away. And he says, well, I have to rebuild the army. But this doesn't help his reputation at the time or to this day. He's regarded as a bit of a coward, I suppose, from that.
Well, he didn't just leave the battlefield. I mean, he galloped away from his own army.
Yeah,
what seemed to be sheer terror.
It seemed like a good idea at the time. And so he then got cashiered, which probably gave, it was a disaster for the cause, probably gave Washington just a tingling of satisfaction, perhaps some personal gratification here, although I'm sure that was only a minor consideration.
No, well, Gates, of course, was the hero of Saratoga,
that's the
one of the more important early battles of the war. I've always been skeptical of Gates getting credit for that. I think Schuyler actually did most of the setup to win that campaign, and Gates kind of swooped in at the last minute. Gates had a bad habit of hanging out in Philadelphia and telling members of Congress what all the other generals were doing wrong. In fact, I think that's a big reason why he was able to replace Schuyler, blaming Schuyler for withdrawing from Ticonderoga without a major fight and all that. And Gates just kind of swooped in and took it at the last minute. If he had done great things later, I might give him more credit as a great strategist. But since we saw him on his own at Camden and what a disaster he was there, I'm reluctant to give him any credit for being any kind of a great tactician or strategist.
Yeah, he seems to have been, up to that point, he seems to have been a master politician.
Yeah.
I don't know anything more about him than what I know up to for Camden, and a little bit more. You know much more about his full career than I do, but my sense of him is that he was brilliant as a strategist, as a political operator, and then actually on the battlefield. I guess, was it Saratoga? Is that where you said he got credited and Washington felt, and Schuyler probably should have gotten it. But he had an ability to turn all these things to his advantage until Camden, and that was the end of that.
Gates was actually a British regular officer before the war in the regular army. He, along with Charles Lee, joined the Continental Army at the beginning of the war, resigned their commissions in the British Army. So he was one of the very few officers with real military experience as an officer. And he was actually a very good administrator. He probably would have been a wonderful logistics officer if he'd stayed in that position. He would have been just fine. One of the things I've noticed from reading a lot about British officers is they kind of make a career of undermining their commanders as a way of moving forward, and doing it in a very subtle way of, not directly attacking them, but making clear that they could do a much better job than their commander. And it's not just Gates that does this. I see this in Sir Henry Clinton, got that from Howe, and Cornwallis was trying to do it to Clinton. And all the officers very kind of subtly undermine their commanders and tell the higher ups that they could do a much better job if given the chance. And Gates tried to pull that after becoming the hero of Saratoga with Washington, and it almost worked.
Washington originally wanted, his ambition was to be a British officer, I believe. Is that how you read it?
Yeah, during the French and Indian War, he spent a lot of the war trying to get a permanent commission.
That's right. That didn't work out so well.
No.
And who you mentioned, Charles Lee, that's a fascinating.
He is. He is another fascinating character in all this.
And his understanding of how the war in the South should have been prosecuted was actually very good. I mean, he kind of understood it in a way that I think it took longer for Washington to come to understand, and Greene even, that it would be fought in, I guess, more of what, I don't know, one of the British press or one of the British politicians at the time said, we're going to be defeated by damn driblets, and encounters that wouldn't even be considered skirmishes. I think Lee sort of had a sense that that was the case and said so. He was right, even though after, and I'm trying to think where he got cashiered.
Well, Lee was actually, he was probably the most experienced officer in the Continental Army. He had actually served as a general in Europe, not in the British Army, but as a British officer on loan to several other armies. He had actually served effectively as a general. So he came with a very experienced military eye to a lot of things and gave a lot of really good advice on different things. He was the one who really encouraged Washington to retreat out of New York City before they got captured in 1776. And of course, when he was taken prisoner later in 1776, a lot of people thought that was going to be the end of the war, that he was the only real experienced officer that the Army had. And in fact, his capture was probably a blessing in disguise, because it meant that the army that he was holding back would go down to join up with Washington in time for his crossing of the Delaware and his Christmas raid on Trenton and all that. So that was probably a good thing.
Was it Tarleton that captured Lee?
Tarleton was not the commander of the unit, but yes, he was an officer in the cavalry unit that captured Lee in New Jersey. Yeah, before that, actually, just to get back to the war in the South a little bit, Lee had been sent down to Charleston in 1776 to go over the defenses there and help out with setting up the defenses in Charleston Harbor. And of course, the British came down, General Henry Clinton and General Cornwallis aboard a naval fleet to try to take Charleston Harbor. And Lee actually recommended that the Americans abandon Fort Moultrie, which was a fort in the harbor on an island that had not been finished, was still a mess, and he thought they were just all going to be taken prisoner real easy. Fortunately, the Americans ignored the advice of this more experienced officer, held the fort, and managed to prevent the British fleet from landing there, and they had to leave.
But then they came back.
Well, they did 4 years later.
Yeah.
But I think those 4 years were critical to the South. One reason the British left the South alone at the very beginning of the war, for the most part, and focused on it more towards the end of the war, was because the British believed that there was a very large Tory loyalist population in the South, and that they didn't have to worry about them being really so much in rebellion as they did New England and the middle colonies. So they, the British did this entirely wrong in hindsight, but what they did made sense at the time, I guess. They saw the war was the rebellion really began in New England, specifically Massachusetts, and so that's where they focused at first. When they realized that that was so much of a mess, it was going to be too much trouble to keep fighting there, they ended up moving into New York and the Mid-Atlantic region, thinking, all right, well, we'll just surround and isolate New England and deal with them that way. And of course, they had all sorts of problems in New York with Saratoga and with all they even though they captured Philadelphia, they were not able to really get the population to come over to their side. And so they thought, all right, well, we failed in all these places. At least we can go save the South, because the South has lots of loyalists, and we'll go do something there. The problem was that they waited too long. The war began in 1775, and they really didn't take the South seriously until 1780.
They seem to have had an idea that if you captured these cities, that would probably be enough. Is that right? Is that how you read it? That if we got New York and we've got Philadelphia, and now we can take Charleston. And the business about the loyalists always reminds me of the Vietnam War, where American strategy, I believe, at one point was we can rely on the Vietnamization of the war, that the Vietnamese will themselves fight off and win the war. And yes, there were loyalists in the South, but their strength was overestimated. One of the few criticisms of my book being the rest being nothing but praise, says that I could have spent more time on the perspective of loyalists. And I think that's true. I wish I understood that better myself. Part of this is interesting too, because I've just been reading a good bit on a completely different topic, but that mentions that, reminds me of this, because they're discussing the extent to which in the 14th, 15th, 16th, even 17th centuries, how ordinary people had very little interest in politics. and they were almost never touched by what we would call the state. That they paid some taxes, and there were dynastic wars that would be fought, and they might be caught up in that. But most of the time, they didn't even pay any attention to what the king was doing or what the prince was doing. And so it would be interesting to see the American Revolution, and particularly the South, with that prism of what got people riled up. And why, what were the motives of loyalists, and to what extent was this geopolitical dispute, to what extent it touched their own lives?
I think that's true. What the British were experiencing was, to use a cliche, a new world order. In Europe, you had peasants who made up the bulk of the population. The peasants were beholden to the local lord, because the lord owned all the land, and land is where you grew food. And if you displeased the lord, he could throw you off your land and your family would starve to death. So the peasants, by necessity, showed loyalty to the lord. But if that lord got overthrown and a new lord came in and made the same deal with them, they really didn't care that much. And of course, the lords held their land by the grace of the king. So the lords showed their loyalty, up to the larger lords, and eventually get up to the king himself. So you're right. They didn't have to convince the population to follow them. A king would not have to convince the population to follow them. He had to convince the lords. The lords had their peasants who they would come out and fight in an army if needed, because they were obligated to. But they didn't have a real feeling of loyalty necessarily to the lords that ruled over them. So when a European power captured a major city and captured the lands, the peasants were like, okay, same deal, right?
Yes.
We grow the food and give you a portion of it.
That's right. And they would, and these could be brutal regimes, but they weren't totalitarian, in that these people, the lords and the princes and the kings, didn't really care much about how these commoners lived. They weren't trying to regulate all of that. And for that reason, as well, as you say, when there was a new regime took over, these questions of patriotism and loyalty, in that sense, were non-issues. I mean, people just went ahead with their lives with somebody else in charge. And
right. I mean, when William Conqueror took over England in 1066 and replaced the other king who was there and most of his lords who were loyal to the old king, the rest of the population kind of just went on business as usual. Yeah, I'm planting my wheat in the spring and harvesting it in the fall. Yeah. And whoever's sitting in the castle up on the hill is kind of irrelevant to me.
Yeah, and so I get a sense that there was these populists getting riled up in this, and the fights that go on, and the militias and the loyalists and all of this is often a civil war. But it's not a civil war over grand ideas or big issues as it's understood by the people who are fighting it. It's neighbors who are taking revenge because somebody shot their son or burned their house or that kind of thing. And it gets very personal rather than ideological. And quite put it that way, but that seems to be the case here.
Right. And what I think was very different in America from what we just described in Europe was that basically every man was a lord. Every man owned property. He owned his own estate. I mean, even relatively poor farmers owned their own land. They weren't completely dependent on some higher lord to rule over them. So each man kind of needed to be convinced on his own what was the right thing to do. Now, of course, most lords tend to follow the king in most cases, because if you defy the king and lose, you lose everything. You lose your property. You may be executed as a traitor. The Scottish people learned that the hard way over and over again. If you're loyal to the king and you support the king in times of trouble, you get rewarded. You may get a title, you may get given new lands, whatever. And kings who stayed in power were very effective of rewarding loyalty and punishing disloyalty in order to build a society that was very loyal to them. So when the war started in America, a lot of people's natural instinct was, we'll stand by the king because we will benefit from that when the king puts down this rebellion. And kings almost always put down rebellions. Yeah. The rebels don't win. What happened in the South, I think, was that they didn't bother to try to put down the rebellion in the South in those early years. And so the patriots were able to do great damage to anyone who thought being a loyalist was a good idea by essentially compelling them to either become patriots or they would expel them from their lands and take away everything they owned and force them to leave the colony, things like that. So there was a great deal of, I think, some of the really early battles early on, like the ability of the South Carolinians to keep the British out of Charleston and the victory at Moores Creek Bridge over the Loyalists in, I think that was 1776. That kind of stymied any kind of real powerful Loyalist movement from growing and maintaining in the South, which meant by 1780, when the British started to get serious about it, the Patriots had been long in control and running things and were well organized, and any would-be Loyalists had pretty much been just keeping their mouths shut and hiding that entire time. So it was much harder for them to organize at that point.
Well, a couple of things. The term that you use there is interesting because I've almost never heard it, read it in contemporary accounts, and that's the word patriot. We routinely think of Tories and Loyalists on one side and British redcoats on the other, and on one side, and then patriots on the other. We think patriot means to love your country, right? That term, I don't know about the North, but in the South, you never heard that term. They sometimes refer to themselves as Whigs, but the term patriot seems to be affixed later, sort of retroactively, as a description of the people who were on the militias and the Continental Army and the irregulars and all of that. I have a cousin in Lexington, Kentucky, who writes books on the Civil War. That's his real interest. And he and I were discussing this once. And I said, Kent, I can't keep all these different groups together. There was standard military histories that will refer to the number of a unit, like the 49th Carolina or something. I'm just making that up. And I said, in the South, these battles, I can't, I'm not even going to try to. The reader's not going to know the 48th from the 49th anyway. And then you have such a mixed bag of participants. So you have Continental regulars, and then you have militia, and then you have irregulars, and then you have deserters from the British Army fighting with what we're going to call the Patriots. And the same kind of thing happening on the British side. And so there's, it's a big mess of people, for example, who are fighting under Francis Marion. I mean, I don't think any of those people had commissions in any formal sense. Very few of them did. There were Black people fighting with Marion, apparently, and on either side at different points. And that seems to be also a different war than the wars in Europe, where there were mercenaries fighting because their lords sent them there, sent them to the army, I believe. You know that area much more than I do. There was a commander of the over mountain men that fight at King's Mountain, for example. These are irregulars of some kind or another. And at one point I believe one of their commanders going up the mountain says something like, every man his own commander, right? And says something to that, go on and you've got to make all your own decisions as we fight this battle. It's sort of echoing in an odd way what I was saying about Washington and his leadership. He's delegating to Greene. Greene is delegating to Morgan. Morgan is delegating, and Morgan and Greene are delegating to Marion and Sumter and Pickens and Lee, not Charles Lee, but Light Horse Harry Lee. So there's a kind of decentralization and a constant delegation of authority that makes the war very interesting, because there's a kind of spontaneity to it and improvisational quality. Maybe that's a better word, where circumstances on the ground in the moment are dictating everything. Now, maybe that's the case in larger European battles. I had cooked up some figures at one point on how large these armies were that were fighting at Borodino in 1812, for example. some of these battles where there would be 100,000 soldiers. Here in the South, we've got 1,500 fighting 1,200, and under people that are guerrilla warriors. So word we would use for it. So it makes a very interesting and different kind of war.
I think that's true. And again, it has to do a lot with the two different environments. The British thought at the beginning of the war, professional soldiers can defeat almost any size of amateur militia because professional soldiers are organized. Their men know to stand their ground in the face of enemy fire. And anybody who's not used to that is usually just going to scatter and run and then can be picked off piecemeal. What the British did not count on was the fact that unlike civilians who were living in England at the time and didn't really know warfare unless they became professional soldiers, the colonists were very familiar with war because they had fought in militia armies, the French and Indian War. And even when there wasn't a war, there was essentially and always an ongoing war with the Indians. There was constant fighting, especially if you lived on the frontier. And, the over-mountain men you mentioned, for example, were constantly fighting with the Indians. So they were very used to fighting on their own, fighting alongside their neighbors, having each other's back. They didn't need an overall officer to tell them what to do because they had spent their entire lives doing combat and preparing for hit and run raids and being subject to hit and run raids by the enemy. They were used to all this stuff.
Yeah,
they were used to fighting.
If you watch something on the History Channel, that's the image I always had, is you will see British redcoats in these strict lines marching across a empty field, and then the wily, hardy American patriots are behind a tree or fence or a stone wall or something, picking them off as these redcoats march in these strict lines in what looks suicidal, which I understand the point they're making there. I think it's misleading to this degree that one thing I got to do in the research for this, I spent some time at the Boston Athenaeum going through Washington's own books. And there were training manuals, books on tactics from the British, in which they were trained. British soldiers were trained at what was called treeing, which was you and another soldier would be behind a tree, and one would come out and fire and then go back behind the tree, and then the other would load and that kind of thing. And they were also, so they were trained to, they knew they had the good sense that if you've got a stone wall to duck under it. You don't see that in the popular, like I think of History Channel depictions of a battle. As far as what you're saying about the training and the assumption that well-disciplined, trained, experienced soldiers will always be able to defeat these. And by the way, my proudest moment in this book is to have written it without ever using the term ragtag, because it's impossible. It's impossible to read a book on the American Revolution or even an article that does not refer to the Americans as ragtag, right? Well, what you're saying there is so interesting because Morgan at Cowpens uses all this to his advantage, so that you've got Tarleton's men in the woods, and Morgan, before the battle, goes from campfire to campfire, talking to these totally inexperienced, untrained men, and says, look, I'm putting you guys in the first line. All you have to do is fire once or twice. 3 times would be terrific. If you can do that, when the British come forward, you will have done your job. Then you could file off. Then you could leave the battlefield. And he says something like, and when this is all over, how the girls will kiss you and the old men will hug you and all of this. And he positions the least experienced on the line, and on the ground on the line. And the British come forward, Tarleton's British come forward with all the confidence and swagger and gleaming bayonets and things that they're proud of. And the front line fires with some effectiveness and then leaves the battlefield. Well, Tarleton interprets this as that the battle is basically over, that we've won, they're running away. So his men come forward, and then they run smack dab into a second line of more experienced soldiers. And pretty soon it is a slaughter. And so Morgan understands how to use the inexperience and lack of training of some of these men. It's a jiu-jitsu move or something. I mean, he's using the enemy's strength and turns it to his own advantage. I think that's a wonderful moment.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Morgan was a tactical genius. And you can see not only did he know the limitations of his militia, but he also knew how the British would react to it. And you take a look at something like Camden, where the more traditional thing happened was the militia broke and ran. The few Continental units stood and got overwhelmed and killed as the British overran them. Everybody kind of expected militia to run pretty quickly in a battle. And so the way you win a battle, of course, is by keeping your men together as a fighting unit, because one man fighting a musket is probably not going to hit anything. You have to fire as a volley, or you're probably not going to hit much of anything. So what Morgan did was essentially get them to fire a couple of volleys, knowing full well they were not going to have to go toe-to-toe with the British. They were going to fire 2 or 3 shots and run. They were okay with that, so they fired their 2 or 3 shots. He got what he got out of them. But then they ran as expected, and the British thought, okay, they're breaking and running. Here's where we win. We run those men down who are running one by one, and we cut them down because they're no longer fighting as an effective unit. So the British didn't stand together as a compact army, as an effective fighting force. They spread themselves out as the cavalry rushed in and the infantry fell behind. And then, of course, they fell right into Morgan's trap, where he had good soldiers that were in fighting units, and the British were all spread out all over the field, thinking they were just going to be running down people running away.
And then there cavalry in the woods behind all of this, coming around to swoop around. What I have come to think about the way the British fought and the way these battles were fought in Europe is that the battle is really fought with the bayonet.
Yeah.
They will march forward and fire, as you say, in volley at the enemy and disorder the enemy's line. And then you run in with the bayonet, which rather than the gun is the weapon that decides the battle. Is that how you see it? Am I right there?
Yes, you are. The firing of weapons was usually just a few shots at the beginning, and then there would be hand-to-hand combat with swords and bayonets. And again, you wanted unit cohesion. You wanted your units to all stick together, your men shoulder to shoulder, because when you have 10 men coming across one man with a bayonet, the 10 men are going to win, no matter how good that one guy is. So you want your men sticking together shoulder to shoulder, so no one's going around behind their backs and stabbing them. I mean, that's a tactic the Romans really excelled at 2,000 years earlier. And that was still the tactic you wanted today. Keep all your men together, fighting as a unit, shoulder to shoulder, comrades in arms. And if you can come across an enemy that's broken and running, it's an easy kill. That was the goal, to force the enemy to break and run them down, and either kill them or force them to surrender.
And in the South, I don't know about the North, but in the South, you didn't even know who the enemy, you couldn't immediately distinguish who the enemy was. And the great example of that is in Alamance County, South Carolina. There's a group of loyalists that are going to join Tarleton, I believe, and they see Light Horse Harry and his troops, and they think they're more British. And because they're the ones who had uniforms, Lee's men had their uniforms were modeled, I think, after Tarleton's. I don't know if that was a coincidence or out of a fashion sense on Light Horse Harry's Lee's part or whatever. So Lee and his men managed to trot up alongside the loyalists, and Lee is trotting along, greeting them, saying, "Oh, you look wonderful, gentlemen," blah, 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 and gets to the head of the line. And only then is it revealed, this is the enemy that has just trotted alongside us. And a slaughter ensues there with Lee's men chopping up the loyalists. when you don't have real uniforms and you have there's constant confusion and deception is possible, which makes all of this all the more fascinating to me.
Right. And that's why there were very few regular troops really on either side. This was mostly fought by militia on both sides. There were a handful of regulars, mostly British or New England, regular loyalists who have been raised in New England and New York and brought down to the South. But overwhelmingly, especially on the Patriot side, this was a war fought by militia, and the militia did not have uniforms. They were lucky if they had a gun, and they just showed up and they looked like a civilian with a gun. And so there was really no good way of knowing what side they were fighting on unless you happened to know the particular man you were facing.
Yeah, well, at Kings Mountain, again, you've got the British officer, Ferguson, who's Scots, is commanding. His entire army is made up of loyalists.
Yeah, Ferguson was the only British officer at that battle.
That's right. And the enemy in this case, the Continentals aren't regulars either. They are farmers from on the other side of the Appalachians who are the over mountain men that are just kind of, and again, in a kind of an improvisational way, they gather and they come back over the mountain and then they come up. Then they surround Ferguson at Kings Mountain and beat him to a pulp. And again, in both those cases, it was Americans fighting Americans, and American irregulars and militia, and that complete mess of disorder that was ultimately so effective.
Yeah, the Kings Mountain is an especially interesting one for me because it was entirely militia on both sides, and the Americans didn't even have their commander, Thomas Sumter, who had a week or two before the battle, somebody else had showed up and said, "Oh, the governor, by the way, made me commander of all the armies." And so Sumter had to ride off to see the governor to confirm that he was still in charge of the armies. And so the Over Mountain men weren't sitting around waiting for an officer. They just went, formed up their units, and went and charged the enemy. Because, as you said, these were Over Mountain men. They were Indian fighters. They were constantly at war, and they knew how to fight. And they knew how to fight what they called in that time period Indian style, which basically meant you were fighting with whatever you had, knives, tomahawks, and as brutally as you could possibly be.
In Washington, in fact, when he put Morgan in office, he said, wouldn't it be great to equip a unit and they fight Indian style? That's what the term I believe he used, and equip them with tomahawks. And so Washington understood this as well. And again, taking what might be viewed as a disadvantage if you're viewing this from a continental European thing, and he saw it as a strength. It's wonderful.
Right, and I think even the British recognized this. You can see General Howe and General Clinton before the war even began, because they had experience through the French and Indian War, calling for more units that specialized at Indian-style fighting, and they were both major advocates of light infantry companies that would be attached to each regiment that would fight more in this style because they could see how successful it would be in America.
Yeah, well, then the geography, the topography in the American South was riddled with rivers and streams, and made moving large armies and equipping large armies very difficult.
Yeah, I think that's true. And you can see the Army's frustration. Of course, General Clinton, who was very upset by the fact that he was not able to take Charleston in 1776, comes back to personally lead the Army in 1780 to take Charleston, and then leaves General Cornwallis in charge of the Southern Army to do all the mop-up and goes home. And I think Cornwallis was probably one of the better British combat generals that they had. He was a very good guy. He got his men to be very loyal and enthusiastic fighters for him. All the things you'd want in a good officer, but he was so frustrated by the fact that he could not bring Greene to a battle on his own terms. Greene had learned by this time that the way to win is not to win a battle, it's to keep an army in the field and snipe at the enemy whenever you can.
Yeah, and then get away as fast as you can. Yeah, that's what makes all these stories so fascinating. They're so individualistic, and word I used earlier is improvisational, which for me as a writer, they're fun stories to tell.
Yeah, I think that's true. You talk about the size of some of these battles being very small. I mean, some of the things that South Carolinians call battles maybe have involved a dozen men total.
Yeah.
These were neighbors fighting neighbors in an almost anarchy situation where, everybody was just, either you're my friend or I'm going to kill you.
That's
there was
right.
no in between.
Yeah, and Andrew Jackson, of course, is taken as a boy, is taken captive in the Revolution and held at Hobkirk's Hill. Is a representative character in that sense, of a rather rough upbringing, and brings that kind of dueling mentality throughout his life. So I got to bring him into this story. His
two brothers died in British custody, and he was badly wounded by a British officer after he was in custody.
And the story of the mother. She came to Hobkirk's Hill to bring the son and Jackson and his older brother home.
Yeah, I think it was Hugh. Yeah.
Yeah, and he dies, and the mother leaves to go to Charleston to help deal with wounded soldiers there, and she died in South Carolina, leaving Andrew as an orphan at a very young age. And so I guess I can't remember what happened to the father, but so the mother and two sons died in the war, leaving Andrew.
Yeah, his whole family died. I think most of them died of smallpox, but yeah, Jackson definitely held the British responsible for their deaths and was a very anti-British attitude his entire life after that.
I can understand.
Yeah, understandably so. And in fact, it was very hard in the South at the end of the war for people to come back together again.
Mm-hmm.
It was most of the loyalists had to leave. They fled with the British when the British finally abandoned Charleston in 1782. Most of them went to, I think, Jamaica, and a handful went to St. Augustine, Florida.
Some went to Canada, I believe.
A few went to Canada, but not a lot. Most of the loyalists that ended up in Canada were from New York or New England.
Okay.
But there probably were some.
Yeah.
Probably the guys who went to St. Augustine had to leave because at some point Britain turned over Florida to Spain again. So all the British had to leave there, have to move a second time. But they definitely had to leave the South. They were not welcome back. There was so much bad blood because there was so much, just everybody had a family member who was killed by someone on the other side, and they weren't particularly in a forgiving mood. All right. Well, Alan Crawford, I really thank you for coming and talk to us for the hour. Your book, again, which is coming out in July, is called This Fierce People, which is a story about the Revolutionary War in the South. And thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
I'd like to thank once again Alan Pell Crawford for speaking with me about his new book, This Fierce People, The Untold Story of America's Revolutionary War in the South. It's due out on July 2nd, 2024. You can pre-order the book today on Amazon, or if you're listening to this after July 2nd, you can just order the book. I've included links to the book on both my blog and website.